Hello and welcome to In the Making, a series of conversations from North Bennett Street School, where we connect with a range of new voices, fields, and perspectives. Before we get into our conversation, we want to thank the many supporters that make our programs possible, including the Massachusetts Cultural Council, the Holt and Bugby Company, and all of our corporate partners in craft. My name is Ja'Hari Ortega. I am a jewelry making and repair student at NBSS and host of this episode of In the Making. To support the In the Making exhibition, currently on view at NBSS through November 30th, I have been awarded the Ideal Internship Grant from the Decorative Arts Trust. The purpose of this grant is to improve access to curatorial careers for students of color as a path towards achieving systemic change in the museum space. For this afternoon program, we are on site at the Royall House and Slave Quarters in Medford, Mass., located on the lands of Indigenous tribes such as Wampanoag and Massachusetts. We want to pay respect to this community as well as to the 60 Black women, men, and children who were enslaved on this very site in the 18th century. As we get into the program, we will explain why we are here. I'm here with my mentor and friend, Stephen Hamilton, a local Boston artist and educator. And Stephen, we'll have you introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your practice while I share some of your work.
So, hi, my name is Stephen Hamilton. I am an artist, researcher, and educator from Boston, Massachusetts. I identify as a traditional artisan as well as an illustrator and fine arts painter. A lot of my work focuses on sort of the integration and incorporation of particular types of weaving, dyeing, and wood carving, common in West and West Central Africa, and Western like portraiture, painting, illustration. And my work is very much looking at how to explore, sort of the intersection of these different types of art making, these different art making practices, but also to explore the world senses and histories of pre-colonial Africa and look at them in relation to histories of the diaspora and contemporary Black experiences.
Can you talk a little bit about how you got started, like your education or any studies that you've done related to your practice?
So I started, it's very hard for me to think about when my art practice started. I don't want to say like, oh, I've always been interested in art, even though it's true that like that's the case for like most artists. I'm very fortunate in the sense that I come from a very creative cultural space. So I grew up in Roxbury, which is a historically Black neighborhood in Boston. I grew up around a lot of like very beautiful public art. That is something that has always like very much informed my practice. Growing up in a place where you would see murals, where you'd see a lot of artwork that was very much contextualized to the community that lived in these particular areas. And, just like any other kid who was, growing up in the 90s and like kids now, I was also really interested in comic books and video games and like all of these different things that were incredibly visually stimulating. So thinking about ways in which my visual language was very much also influenced by pop culture. But, ever since I was young, I was really into reading. My mom pushed the importance of reading from a very young age. And one of the things I loved reading as a kid was actually encyclopedias. So I was like really interested in reading like all of these like tomes that were just like collections of knowledge. And I was also really interested in history and looking at my place in history as like a Black person. So yeah, I remember I would read the encyclopedias like before I went to bed as a kid. I would read about like the Mali Empire. I would read about all these different countries in Africa. My mom also used to buy me all these books about African-American inventors and things of that nature. So that was something that was like really like formative for me. when I was really young. When I was in high school, I had the opportunity to attend the scholarship. It was a scholarship program for a free art class that was available for high school students at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. And I started going there my junior year of high school. And then my senior year of high school, I had the opportunity to go to Art a la carte, which was another nonprofit organization, that gave college preparatory art courses to high school kids in Boston. And what was really interesting about that experience is that like really opened the door for me to think about art school as a possibility, and like thinking about art making as a career as a possibility. Because even though I had always been really interested in drawing and painting, like it became more plausible. It became more plausible as a career choice from those experiences. So from there, I went to Mass Art. When I was at Mass Art, I majored in illustration, which was an interesting experience. I learned a lot at Mass Art. And what was really interesting is even though I was an illustration major, I also took courses in other departments. So when I was during my junior year in college, I took a fiber arts course. It was surface design on fabric, where I was learning tie and dye and wax resist dyeing using fiber reactive dyes. And that was my earliest experience working with fiber. I did work with fiber before when I was much younger. I talk about this really fondly. My grandmother would always humor me when I was young because I wanted to like make my own Halloween costumes. So my grandma actually taught me how to sew when I was like 8. So I learned how to do like blanket stitches and like basting stitches when I was like a little kid because she taught me how to sew and we'd make Halloween costumes. I always wanted to be something really over the top, like a dragon or something. But yeah, but other than that experience, that was my first experience working with fiber. I graduated from Mass Art. I worked at Art a la carte as a mentor. I also started working at Artistry Humanity fairly soon after I graduated from college, which was another amazing experience. And one that really also helped shape and form my practice as an educator and as a teacher. I left Artistry Humanity because I got a grant from Arts Connect International to go to Nigeria. Arts Connect International is still an organization that works around arts equity, but at the time, they funded an international artist in residency program where they would pay you to learn, they would pay you to sort of craft the international artist residency over a year. So I had the opportunity to go to the Nikkei Center for Art and Culture. And I was in Nigeria for 9 months. So I was in Osogbo, Lagos, in Ogidi Jumu, which is in Kogi State. So Ogidi is in Kogi State. It's in the northeastern part of Yoruba land, southwestern part of Nigeria, but northeastern part of Yoruba land, close to the Niger River. And it's there that I learned traditional weaving, wood carving, natural dyeing. So I learned indigo dyeing with kola nut, dyeing with other natural dyes. I was really into books. So I had learned some things about the Yoruba religion before I had gone to Nigeria, but it was when I was in Nigeria and actually had a chance to like have conversations with and study with people who are practitioners of traditional Yoruba religion, Babalawo, other Olorisha. I learned a lot in the sense that I learned a lot more than I had known. But I did have the opportunity to learn a lot more about traditional Yoruba religion, which also continued to impact my work. So that's sort of a trajectory from like my earliest like experiences as like a young artist to sort of like the things that have impacted my practice now. The work that you're seeing now is sort of a culmination of those experiences. But what was very transformative for me was that opportunity to be in Nigeria for such a long period of time. And the skills that I learned, the actual craftsman skills that I learned when I was there, very much transformed the nature of my work.
That's awesome. Yeah. So we are looking at some images of your process, and I think it's really, I mean, this is only one of many examples. I think it's really interesting, and I can kind of relate to like wanting to like take in all of the different crafts and techniques and things like that. But when I saw these images, I found it really interesting because you go through this multi-step process to come to this final piece. But you make, well, I think you told me you make the jewelry that your models wear, as well as some of the props and the top, like the weavings and the dyes. Can you talk a little bit more about your process and what's involved?
Awesome. And shout out to all of the people who made this artwork happen.
Yes.
So like the photographer is my cousin, an amazing photographer, Stacey H. Hamilton. She's an amazing photographer, and the photo was actually part of a collaboration that we did. So we collaborated on creating these photos. So I, was providing the props and doing a lot of the styling and the posing. But Stacey is the photographer. And her expertise as a portrait photographer is what actually brought those photos to life. Portia Olayuola is an amazing poet, an incredible poet. And they responded to the open call for models for the paintings. I actually ran into her at events, and like we had just like had a conversation, and like I was like, I would love to paint you. So actually she was not a part of the model call, because I had seen her perform on Instagram before. I was like, wow, like that energy is like, I want to paint her. But yeah, and like she posed and it was incredible. The process for that was also Stacey and I interviewing people. So it wasn't interviews in like, we're gonna sit down and we're gonna have a conversation, and we're gonna pick you or not. Like pretty much everybody who decided to commit to a date and a time was photographed. So we asked people how they saw themselves and how they'd like to be seen by others. And we, through like having these sort of conversations around these ideas of self-representation and self-image, we sort of like crafted these images. And I was also thinking about particular iconography in pre-colonial African artwork, and also traditional African artwork created during the colonial period as well. Thinking about how people's responses can sort of inform how I want to have that element of the work inform the images. So, once like we have a conversation about the direction and they approve that, they're okay with it, then, they're dressed and then we pose them. So I made the sword that Portia is holding. I also wove the shawl that she's wearing. The wrapper that's around her body is made of muslin that I dyed. So I did Nico. I did tie and dye on the cloth inside with indigo. And the vest that she's wearing, I sewed. It's made from hand-woven fabric, but I didn't weave that fabric. That was strip woven cotton fabric that I bought. It's from Mali originally, but I did like the sewing of like the cowries and sewing it together. I carved the two panels that flank her. I also did the staining and the coloring for that. And behind her is a tie and dyed cloth that's dyed with kola nut dye. And behind her is a piece of burlap that's dyed with fibroreactive dyes. That's the only thing that and the threads for the cloth that I wove are the only things that are using synthetic dyes. So a lot of the objects that are in the photo are handmade objects. the photograph then, influences the drawing, which you can tell also I'm making creative changes to the drawing. And then the drawing is also being reinterpreted from the painting. So the paintings are also not always copies of the drawing. So there's like these different ways in which, I'm making very conscious choices about how I want to change the direction of the image as it moves from each stage. But she's depicted as Ogun. So Ogun is Ogun is the god of the origin of iron and war in Yoruba land. And he also represents all things that iron is used for. So in addition to being associated with hunting and war, he's also associated with industry, and he's often associated with craftsmanship. So he's actually a god of wood carvers, a god of blacksmiths, a god of other types of metal workers, a god that's associated with tattoo artists, because tattoo artists also use iron. They use blades to make incisions, and then soot is then rubbed into the incisions to create permanent tattoos, these raised tattoos called lolo or polo by the Yoruba people. He's a very hot and masculine deity, but in parts of Yoruba land, there are women who are priestesses of Ogun, and it's very fascinating when you're seeing them in festivals. They'll embody the masculine agency of Ogun, but they also have like there's an elegance about them. So there's an image of an Igbomina woman. The Igbomina are a subgroup of the Yoruba people. And then there's other images also from Ijebu and like other parts of Yoruba land of women who are embodying the energy of Ogun. And there was one woman, she was so regal, she had her hunter's vest that had all the medicine packets attached to it. And she was wearing a white cloth around her shoulder and the hunter's cap. You can see the very distinctive hunter's cap that they wear. And she was holding daggers. And like she was like posed in this very regal pose. And there was something so beautiful about the way she was posed and the way that she was embodying simultaneously this like very masculine agency and power of the deity, but also this like feminine elegance. And that was also an inspiration for the piece. So when I was thinking about how to paint her, I was thinking about that. So there is like all of this element of like masculine power and agency. You see like the hunter's jacket that's dyed with indigo that she's wearing in the painting, but also all of these calabashes that are filled with medicine. She's wearing the mariwo, which is the palm fronds that you'll see the Ogun priests wearing around their waists and their shoulders. Palm fronds are also symbolic of Ogun. She's holding this like knife, she's holding this large like cutlass. It's also the vest is thick with medicinal substances and this like sort of dark, like rich, like heavy, like gruff materials. But then she's wearing this elegant indigo dyed ibonla. So this like big wrapper, this big shawl that's around her that's dyed with indigo and beaten to a high sheen that's like really elegant and beautiful. She has this Adire shawl. I hand wove the shawl, and then I dyed it with indigo and then over dyed it with it's like sumac and iron to gray it out a little bit. And then her arms have the tattoo on her forearm. You can see a bit of the tattoo, which is also symbolic of beauty, but also is associated with Ogun and is associated with cutting and marks and like blood and things of that nature. So it's sort of balancing like this masculine power with also this elegance. And that's sort of the inspiration for the work. I also did some aluminum pressing, some like embossing with aluminum. And that's to create like the panels that are on the side. Those panels that are in the actual final painting, they're inspired by one of my favorite Nigerian artists, Bruce Anabakpeya. amazing artist that does work with like casting and also embossing. Beautiful work that he creates. He is a Royall artist from South Central Nigeria. Does beautiful, beautiful work, but that was also sort of an homage to him. But yeah, that's sort of like the process, and that's also thinking about the ideas that are behind the work, thinking about the ways that I'm incorporating elements of Yoruba religion and philosophy in the work, but also all of the different materials that are part of it.
Yeah, and here's just a few images of, like, we have a close-up of one of your pieces that show where the weaving, and is that muslin here where the horse's face is?
So that one is denim.
Denim.
Yeah, that's denim. I was gifted a little bit of denim to use in a project. But it is kola nut and indigo that's dyed over the denim. And the woven part is made mostly of hemp, but also some jute and some cotton. That is the robe that's painted on is inspired by robes that are woven in Liberia, Sierra Leone, some other parts of like West Africa, part of that grand robe tradition that you see all over West Africa that's associated with like statesmen and nobility and things of that nature. Coming out of like an Afro-Islamic tradition that's also still, incorporated into non-Islamic practices, specifically around traditional African religion and ritual. But I also wanted to reference that like sort of grand tradition of cavalry and statesmen and horsemanship too. So that's the reason why it's juxtaposed like that. But it's mixing together a lot of different materials, and it's mixing together a lot of different techniques. So I wove that woven piece on an upright loom, which wouldn't typically been, that type of cloth wouldn't typically be used to make robes like that. But yeah, it's like sort of like a mixing of like different skills and techniques and materials to sort of.
So you have the natural dyeing, the weaving, and the painting on top of all of that.
Yes.
Wow. And then we have an image of some of your wood carving as well. And then a progress photo of actually the piece that's at North Bennett Street right now. And this is made of?
So it's made of jute and raffia. So the technique that I'm using there is a supplementary weft patterning that you see across West and West Central Africa. You see it in other weaving traditions as well. This particular technique where you're seeing the raffia float sort of stick out of the edge, that's something that you see mostly in West Central Africa, where they're using raffia looms to create cloths that don't have selvages. They also create cloths that do have selvages, but like that specific technique you mostly see in West Central Africa and some parts of Nigeria, some parts of Eastern Nigeria. But it's made using multiple heddles. I wanted to create a cloth that was like made of pure raffia, but that was a little bit difficult. So I decided to go for jute. Different types of, so jute is usually when you're talking about jute, you're talking about like different types of like porous fiber, and also like allied jute, which also includes hibiscus. And a lot of parts of West Africa in the past did use hibiscus. You see some like archaeological digs in Mali showing that people were weaving with hibiscus fibers in Mali. You see people writing about what they call sisal, African sisal, but it's actually like hibiscus fiber in parts of Cameroon and Nigeria. And there are like a lot of different types of bast and like porous fibers that used to be used. So jute is like a close comparison to that. So like I was using that because that's also a fiber that's very similar to the types of bast fibers that would have been used in parts of West Africa in the past. And also anyone who's dyed with jute, it takes dyeing really well. Cotton is very difficult to dye. The mortising process is very long to get good results on cotton. you can do, other types of mortaring processes like aluminum acetate, which isn't that difficult, but it's still more of a multi-step process. But jute doesn't really require that much. And you can still get really, really strong color. So I dyed that with camwood, and then the raffia is undone. So you can see like this like really beautiful like brick red color as the background, and then the like golden raffia is sort of coming out. But this is a technique, the multiple heddle technique is something you see in different parts of Nigeria, textiles that are made in parts of Yoruba land specifically, or will use like multiple heddles. You'll see some of them, they're using like 17 heddles to create the pattern. Parts of Central Africa, which is also what was inspired this cloth, you'll see them use pattern sheds. So they'll just insert extra shed sticks to create the pattern. The wood carving, that is inspired by traditional Yoruba doors. And that pattern is very particular about the pattern we specifically as a Yoruba door.
I don't know what you mean by. I was very particular about that pattern. How about a web search for it?
So like I wanted there to be 16 birds and 16 faces. 16 is a very important number in Yoruba traditional religion. There are 16 major Odu, 16 sons of Oduduwa. Like the 16 is like a big number. So I wanted to reference that, and I also wanted to use iconography that you see in Yoruba sculpture. So the images of these faces and these birds, the birds symbolic of the Awonyawa, the divine mothers, the Eleye, the owners of birds, like these sort of like ambivalent feminine forces that have the power to create and destroy at the same time. So I carved that. It's dyed with guinea corn stalk, sorghum bicolor. There's a specific type of sorghum where the sheaths will give a very deep burgundy color, and it's used as a natural wood stain in Africa. It's also used to dye baskets. You can dye wool with it. In Portuguese, they call it carmim de sorgo. It was actually exported to a little bit to parts of Europe where they're using it to dye leather. It's also used to dye leather in many parts of Africa, goatskin leather in many parts of Africa. And it creates a beautiful, beautiful burgundy color. Yeah.
And you make your looms and some of the tools that you use to weave as well, right? Can you talk a little bit about that?
So the looms are the brilliant thing about the loom that I use is it's very simple. It's a very ancient type of loom, indigenous to parts of West and West Central Africa. Some of the more simple ones are just simply two logs that are leaned up against a wall, and then two raffia branches, which are cut and then hung from these two like logs. And with like these very, very simple looms, you can see like textiles of just incredible complexity that are woven on them. So what I usually do is I just create a very simple frame, and then I'm basically using two beams and setting the warp along those two beams that are affixed to that frame. And as you weave, it's a rotary warp loom. So as you weave, the warp is moving around those two beams in a tube. So it's usually like if the beams are 4 feet apart, the cloth is going to be from tassel to tassel.
Right. Yeah. So earlier, we mentioned that we are at the Royal Housing Slave Quarters here in Medford. And can you tell us a little bit about like why we're here and the work that you've done here?
So shout out to Kiara Singleton, who was a really awesome director of the of Royal House and Slave Quarters, just like really good friend, brilliant scholar. So, you know, when I had these conversations about work that I wanted to do with Kiara around reclamation and reclaiming sort of this knowledge that was either exploited or dissociated from Africans in the diaspora during the transatlantic slave trade, she was like, yeah, this would be great programming for us to have here. And we worked together to craft the summer program to teach young people traditional art forms, traditional textile art forms from West Africa, within the context of slavery in the United States. So they were learning about traditional West and West Central African textile arts, but they were also learning about the historical intersections between these textile traditions and also histories of slavery in the United States. There were enslaved people here in Medford, specifically at this location, that were working as weavers and seamstresses and likely dyers as well, and spinners. And many of these people would have come from parts of West Africa with extensive weaving and textile art traditions. And many of these skills, specifically sewing and spinning, would have been skills that young girls would have had to learn in their youth while they were still living in Africa. So learning about that, learning about the history of textile production in West Africa, but also learning about how that was exploited in the Americas, and thinking about what does it look like to teach kids about these traditional practices and having them create their own work reclaiming these practices that are ancestral practices for us in the diaspora. So that's sort of my relationship with this place, and also with my own research as a as a researcher who's looking at the deep history of textile production in Africa. I'm a PhD student at Harvard in African Studies and History, thinking about what cloth means to people over long extents of time, long periods of time and space. Mm-hmm. So thinking about, what are the significances of cloth in pre-colonial Africa? What is cloth meaning to people in Africa during the transatlantic slave trade? How that meaning is attached to very deep histories going back thousands of years, but then also thinking about elements of continuity and change. How does that change over time? And how does that also appear in the cultural traditions and also patterns of production and consumption for us in the Americas during slavery and after slavery? How are textiles part of our world building strategies, our cosmologies, our world sense? And looking at histories of slavery, even just on this site, are very illuminating. So like, again, thinking about the production of hand-spun cotton in Africa, that was often a labor for women and children, and it was a very widespread, it was a very widely dispersed skill. And then thinking about looking at plantations where enslaved Africans are working as spinners, and some of them are using spinning wheels, which are not used in West Africa, but some are using drop spindles, which are. There's actually a site in South Carolina where they uncovered remnants of pretty much slave operated textile industries, cottage industries around spinning and sewing, and they found African style ceramic spindle wheels at the site. So like these connections of production are very important. These histories of production are very important, and the skill and knowledge associated with this production is very important. So encouraging people to understand that, when you see that enslaved people are doing work in a place, thinking about them not only capturing people's bodies, but also capturing their labor. And there's a saying, people came over empty-handed, most of the time, not all the time, but they didn't come empty-headed. Mm-hmm. So how is this knowledge also impacting, quote unquote, skilled production in the United States and in the Caribbean and in Latin America?
So I'm grateful. You've taught many people, and I'm very grateful to have been one of your students. I'm wondering like who your teachers are. Yeah. And what you have learned from them, and also like what kind of inspires or motivates you.
Mm-hmm. I have so many. So if I think about like back in high school, I had so many like people. I don't want to forget anybody, but like Art a la carte, it was Jamil Parker, the late Jamil Parker, and Deborah Aspen. Jamil Parker was my teacher at Art a la carte and was very much a mentor to me and like a lot of other people that we know. Deborah Aspen was like the head of the program, but she was also one of my teachers as well when I was in high school. I remember, you know, Jesse Cardozo and West, like they did a mural project at Fenway High School. And I remember working with them and like, see, they were like adults and they were like the adult like artists that were there. And it's like, you know, they're both artists still now, and just as like an art teacher. But I remember like, you know, having that experience of working with them and that being very formative for me. And then thinking about, you know, being at Mass Art, like I had a lot of amazing teachers at Mass Art. I think about, you know, after I graduated from Mass Art and I was working as a mentor at Artists for Humanity, you know, I learned a lot of my praxis as a mentor and a teacher from Rob, from Pro Black. Just seeing how he not only interacted with students, but also how he built relationships with young people over a very long period of time. So he's still a mentor and a friend to a lot of the people that he worked with over a long period of time. And that really, again, like establishes for me like a praxis for teaching, but also a praxis for being in community with people. And that's something that's a little bit different from being a teacher versus a mentor, like thinking about being in community with people for a very long period of time. And I think about that too. And even like people who, you know, I may not have had, you know, regular interactions with, but like just like I could like visit in their studio and talk to for a long time, like Paul Goodnight and Ekwa Holmes, like you would go for open studios and they would just talk to you.
Right. Yeah.
And they were some of the first people who was just like, you know, you just like have like, it's just like have an organic conversation. They don't mind sharing that time with you. So them, and even now I think about like elders like in our community, Napoleon Jones Henderson, you know, Sharon Dunn.
Yeah.
You know, Sharon Dunn was like one of my teachers at Mass Art, who's like I was able to keep in contact with for a longer period of time. So there's just like so many people who have like impacted me as an artist, but also thinking about all Chandra as well, because also the way that Chandra Mendez Ortiz, the way that she like appears in community, and the way that she exists in community with people that she's taught and mentored. So there's a lot of different people, and I take, you know, different elements of my own teaching and mentoring practice from them.
It's nice to hear, like, you know, obviously, you know, you and I are both a part of that community, and it feels really nice. Like, you know, your names are pretty much identical to the people that I would, you know, name, and just, you know, these people are our neighbors. These people are, you know, people who not only are educators, but will invite you to their home or their studio. And, you know, for me being a student and being able to now like help teach something that I learned, I don't know, that part of that community thing where it's like, you know, there's something being passed down, and it's really like a language for me. And I don't know, we can ramble about something.
I also, you asked about mentors, and I forgot some of my most important mentors. Miss Agnes Umeche, who taught me weaving, Mr. Kunle, Mr. Kunle Arumi, who taught me wood carving in Nigeria. So these are two of my most important mentors. Also, Chief Nike Okundaye, who runs the Nike Center for Art and Culture, one of the most famous like artists in Nigeria, incredibly warm person, but also brilliant, and is like a librarian. Taught me so much about natural dyeing, its history, like just like wild. And it's like I would have conversations with her, And I would look up like academic papers and things like that and like find like bits of the information that she would tell me. She, of course, her living it knows so much more. But just like incredible. So like I'm so sorry I did not immediately mention those three people, because those three people have been very formative for me in my practice. Yeah.
Another question, this one's for both of you. Where do you find, and whoever wants to answer first, go for it. Where do you find the connection between being an artist and a craftsperson?
So that's deeply intertwined in the work that I do. And I respect the fact that there are some artists that do not identify as craftspeople and craftspeople who do not identify as artists. However, I identify as both. And oftentimes the distinction that's made between the two has a lot of like racial and gendered connotations that are attached to it. And I'm thinking about that in terms of the history of quote unquote craft in parts of West and West Central Africa, and whose art forms are considered craft and whose art forms are considered art. So if I'm thinking about the like West African context, that there are differentiations between somebody who just makes utilitarian bowls and people who make these very beautiful, elaborate, like carved objects. But the person who makes these elaborate carved objects is also a craftsperson. Like they also know how to make the bowl. So like craft is integral to their process as an artist. It's the same with weavers and dyers. Like the craft is integral to their process and the work that they're creating as an artist. For me, my work can't be separated from craft. And the reason why is because every time I'm weaving, every time I'm carving, every time I'm dyeing things, it is an act of reclamation. So I'm thinking about this as an act of reclamation of a particular skill and art form that is an ancestral art form. So for me, the actual doing and the actual making and figuring out how to achieve certain elements through the use of craft, achieve certain aesthetic ideals through the practice of craft can't be removed from my work. That's what part of what the work is about. So when I think about art and craft, for me, they're inseparable from each other because my artistic practice is rooted in these crafts. It's rooted in this craft as an art as a form of almost ritual.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think for me, it's kind of a way of like understanding. And I think for me, I also see myself as both, and craft is kind of like the layers of what the art is, in a way. And it's just like, you know, not only am I making this thing that may exist on a wall or in a gallery, but the process of making the thing was very specific and took a lot of time. And, you know, even in art school, when you're getting critique, a part of that critique, depending on the department, I'm only speaking from my experience, was crafts. Like, not only are we looking at how we're viewing the thing, but how is it made? If you are making bowls or whatever, like, will it hold the liquid? Like, you know, there's like, if you're making jewelry, like, you know, does the clasp work? Not only, you know, and a lot of, you know, the works that you were talking about, and, you know, other works that, you know, go beyond this conversation, if we look into history, they also serve a purpose. And, you know, now you might just see them like hung up in a museum, but the history of that, like, it served a purpose. And I think that, again, kind of like you said, that doesn't, for me, never gets removed from what the work is. But yeah.
Thank you. A question about your technique, Stephen. Your work has multi-dimensions. You have wood carving, weaving, painting, and photography. Do you delineate which one you put more energy into, or
Mhm.
is it just a series of however long it takes for each piece component of that until it's, a completed thing, or do you actually math that out?
I don't math it out. It's so difficult for me when people, oh, how long does it take? It's like months. Like it takes so much time to create the work, but I'm not necessarily mapping out how much time each process will take. It takes the time that it takes. But I would say the weaving and the dyeing take the longest amount of time. Because when you're working with dyeing, you're working with very time intensive processes. So like, for example, if I'm working with indigo and I need a very dark color, it has to be dyed multiple times. So I'm dedicating an entire day to doing that work, most likely. When I'm working with other types of dyes that need to be, where the fibers need to be mordanted, that's gonna be a 3-day process for me to adequately dye those fibers. The weaving, depending on the patterns, may take weeks. The paintings take however long the paintings take. That's probably the fastest part of the process. But even then, I have to be in a space where I'm able to work on them, where I'm able to really figure out that process. It's also one of the more improvisational parts of the process as well. So it takes a very long time, and I can't really predict how long it's going to take for each piece to sort of come about.
Another question for you. You mentioned earlier how you grew up around beautiful public art and how much that informed your life and your practice. And then Ja'Hari, you just mentioned a second ago about works of craft and art that end up getting hung in a museum. These are two opposing, forces of digesting art, the enclosed, sometimes problematic museum worlds with less access and amazing public art that you grow up around. How, what are each of your feelings on, where you want your work to be in the context of that?
No, I have many criticisms about museums, and I will continue to have criticisms about museums, but that's just the nature of the world. We reserve the right to critique these institutions and say they're supposed to serve the public. However, I do think that there is a possibility when it comes to what a museum could be, what a museum could look like. And within that possibility, that is a space that I want my work to live. I would love for my work to be accessible to the communities I create the work for. And when I think about that level of accessibility or the politics of that accessibility, that doesn't always, sync with your work being in a private institution or in somebody's home or even at a gallery. So when I'm thinking about what it looks like to have these pieces in a space that is committed to sharing art with the general public or sharing art with communities, that looks like a museum often, but it doesn't necessarily look like what museums exist as now. Rather the idea of what a museum could be. I do have a preference for public institutions when it comes to where my work will live. So when it comes to like where I want my work to live, like who I give precedence for it's typically is museums or other types of public institutions or other types of organizations whose work and politics very much align with mine. So that's sort of like how I feel about that. But I do have a very particular love for public art. I had the opportunity to create like my first like mural, like outdoor mural. It was great. It was through Street Theory and Black Market Nubian. And I had amazing people help me. Curtis helped me. Jeff Enriquez is like an amazing muralist who also like helped get me started. I was very well taken care of throughout that process, but you know, that's work that exists in the neighborhood that I grew up in that's accessible to everybody. So, you know, there's very little that can compete with that. But if I'm thinking about these elaborate installations that I create, where I want them to exist, where I want them to live, are places where other people can enjoy them.
I wouldn't say anything different. I completely agree with that. Another thing about museums is, you know, I think I love what you said about like just like where they can go, because I think there's this like, you know, it's a space that could and does get used and that's accessible in a way, but also in terms of the language that's happening within the institution, whether or not, you know, people feel welcome and invited is a huge part of that. They might be interested in the work inside the building, but just entering the door and feeling like, you know, okay, I'm comfortable and I belong in this space is still another obstacle that I kind of can't help but to take into consideration. So yeah, everything you said and that.
What are you currently both drawn to exploring now?
So I really, I'm at the point with my PhD where a lot of my work is unfortunately not in my studio, but what I want, and if anybody who is affiliated with the institution that I'm at is on this call, I don't think they are, but if they were to hear this, I would want them to hear this. I'm really interested in this idea of critical fabulation. I love like the way that Saidiya Hartman uses it in her work as a historian, but I think that there's so much that's possible in terms of historical imagination in uncovering the African past through critical fabulation and thinking about what does it look like to imagine these periods deep in African history through illustration, through painting, through installation, through sculpture, through reproducing textiles that are no longer textiles from traditions that no longer exist. Looking at historical evidence, whether that's, you know, historical linguistics, whether that's lexicostatistics, archaeology, you know, oral histories, and thinking about creating these immersive experiences, thinking about building worlds, and using my skills as an artist to reconstruct that, to begin to reconstruct or imagine that history, or to create, you know, a visual exploration of that history. And that's something that I'm really interested in. That's something that I'm very much fascinated by. And that is a direction that I mean, it's already part of my work. The work that you see is very heavily researched. It's, if you think about like a paper and you look at the bibliography of a paper, like I could do a bibliography of like the paintings that I make. But thinking about what it looks like to push that in other directions, to think about what would it look like to create a history book that's illustrated, but not necessarily thinking about it as like these are illustrations which assist the textbook, but rather the illustrations, rather the visual aspects of that being the key way in which you are teaching about history, or you know, illustrating a world or immersing people in that experience. Thinking about other forms of media which are dealing with visual storytelling. So there are people who do comic books about it. So there's Abina in the Abina and the Important Men, which is talking about a case relating to slavery in the Gold Coast in what's now Ghana. You know, there was another one that won a very famous prize. It was a comic book of Beowulf. And it was literally accurate enough for you to use it as a textbook in a school. So what does it look like to think about new ways in which you can educate people about the past or think about history?
I love that.
What about you, Ja'Hari? Last question. What are you currently drawn to exploring now?
Well, I was just gonna say something about what you just said that just kind of like blew my mind and like filled my heart at the same time. Because as a student, so I have been taught by artists since elementary school. Well, elementary school, but middle school in particular, I started to take art education courses like as a student. And then I went to an art high school and then an art college, and we learn about the different ways people absorb and retain information. And being able to turn in a painting, after having read a book or listened to a story, or to kind of prove that you absorbed the information that you were supposed to be graduating having known, but doing it through a language that comes natural, a language that you understand, just always like just felt right and makes it more exciting to learn something. But also, in my experience, and actually I've had this conversation with a couple of my peers, sometimes like you're drawn to a material, a technique, and don't yet know why until after you continue to work with that material and technique, and then you do research about it. And for whatever reason, like I don't know, some people believe in different things, but like you learn that like, oh, this is exactly what your ancestors did for you. Like, well, I guess that makes sense now. But yeah, so that just what you were saying just got me really excited about that being a normal thing like everywhere. But what am I excited about lately? I don't know. I feel like I'm still in the beginning of my like art career and things like that. And, I'm excited to be kind of making this like, slowly but surely making this transition into like, what you have taught me, I am now helping you teach others. And I am now like accepting or applying for spaces to show my own work and join that conversation in a different way that's being had like in our community, in public spaces, and or in more gallery or museum settings as well. So I'm excited to continue my research, to continue learning about the work that I've started, and also to be walking on this path that people like Steven and some of the other mentors that he had mentioned like have kind of created, and I'm really grateful to be a part of.
I also think I can answer the first question, which is I really wish that I understood the importance of rest earlier. Like I think the work that I do is very time intensive, but I think when I was much younger, I adopted very, very toxic ideas about like labor and work, and thinking about like this sort of like really toxic like grind like culture that was very much fueled by this idea that you're like not enough. It's very complicated and toxic, and also a conversation that we've had multiple times, and it's still something that I'm struggling with, but understanding the importance of rest. And I was fortunate enough to have this, but also knowing that you need to find your people. You need to find people who are like-minded individuals who are able to help you foster like a very positive creative environment. So understanding what community looks like for you as an artist is super important. A lot of times we think it's like you just being by yourself in the studio. In reality, you do need to find people who mesh with you, find like-minded individuals who are able to create support networks with you as a creative person.
Noted. Well, thank you everyone who has attended today virtually. And thank you, Steven, so much for joining me. And I hope you all have a great evening.